This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Anyway, for those who don't know me, I'm Adam Chapman, Editor and Training Coordinator for BCH, and I'm chairing this evening's seminar. Most of you, I'm sure, have signed in on the sign-in sheets provided, and that's good. If you haven't, please do, or just, and all will be well. You got time for a pint afterwards, Judith?
Of course.
Archaeologists always have time for a pint. It's one of the better qualities. So we'll be going for a pint, probably the Birkbeck Bar afterwards, if that's okay with everybody. In the meantime, it falls to me to introduce Tudor Skinner of the Durham University Archaeological Unit, among other things. Completed his PhD at Durham not so very long ago. And I could waffle on a bit. And this is the first and possibly last seminar I've ever commissioned in the course of a pub quiz. We didn't win. Weren't any questions on Danelaw. So I'm sure you're all delighted to welcome Tudor to talk about the topic of his PhD, which was meeting places in Northern Danelaw, circa 900 to circa 1100. And I'll let him get underway. Now we've actually got audio vids, people in the room, chairs, all the rest. Okay, off you go.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, I'm here tonight to present the results of my research into early medieval assembly practices in the Northern Danelaw. This was undertaken under the auspices of the Assembly Project, an international collaboration running from 2010 to 2013, involving academics and students from the universities of Oslo, Bergen, Vienna, Durham, and the University of the Highlands and Islands. This sought to interrogate the evidence for the form, functioning, and development of the sites of popular courts and their wider landscapes in order to understand their role in the development of collective identities, emergent polities, and kingdoms in early medieval Northern Europe. Varied strands investigated how sites of assembly and associated administrative systems are developed in both the Scandinavian homelands and regions of colonisation, including Iceland, the Northern Isles, and the Faroes. Consideration also turned to the role of trade and the historiography of scholarship on assembly. One of the overriding themes to emerge was that these assemblies clearly did not emerge as part of a simple top-down initiative. In Norway, links can be drawn between the courtyard sites of the earlier first millennium and smaller assembly territories that were consolidated within the expanded and formalised lord provinces that emerged at the end of the early medieval period. In colonised areas like the Shetlands and parts of mainland Scotland, monumental reuse appears to have been very frequent. This reflects an association noted across northwest Europe between sites of assembly and cultic foci, often mortuary in character. It also indicates a process of negotiation with the contemporaneous inhabited landscape rather than the simple migration of Scandinavian conciliar practices. My own role was to investigate land assembly practices in the Northern Danelaw as a means to provide insight into how local political processes acted and reacted to the political changes that accompanied the shift from the Kingdom of Northumbria through to the varied polities of the Danelaw and subsequently to the emergence of the Kingdom of England. In practice, this meant that much of my work concerned drawing together the varied surviving materials on the Hundred and the Wapentake at a regional level, two devices of local governance found in much of the Danelaw. This work took place at the same time as UCL's Landscapes of Governance project, a nationwide initiative to research and analyse the place name and archaeological evidence for the Hundred and Wapentake sites and landscapes. Before continuing, I should define my terms and clarify what I mean by assembly, by hundred, and of course by wapentake. Okay. Assemblies took, and indeed take, many forms. Conventions recorded from early medieval Europe range from the Icelandic Althing to the Frankish Malus, to synodical conventions and even military musters. However, despite great disparities in function, attendance, and geographical remit, each were noted for the negotiation, imposition, and display of political power. In their later forms, predominantly, but not always underwritten by a territorial aspect. As such, they formed an essential component in the emergence and development of polities in post-Roman Europe. In Anglo-Saxon England, the intermittent record of royal courts and synods found in the works of Bede and the varied Anglo-Saxon chronicles provides only sparse indication of the structures of governance in place for much of the period. However, by the mid-10th century, a more detailed system of hundreds and wapentakes emerges from surviving law codes, with specific ordinances directing the operation of their courts. Their existence is demonstrated most visibly in the late 11th century by Domesday Book, where they are found to comprise routine subdivisions of the varied counties reckoned within the survey. The 100 was found throughout southern England and much of the Danelaw, and encompassed both a territorial jurisdiction, a regular court, a corporate body who owed suit to said court, and the officials that presided therein. The wapentake is less well defined, largely because it has so frequently been glossed as a Northern Hundred. The term wapentake is first encountered in Edgar of Wessex's Whitbord Stamp Decree of the early 960s, where indeed it is glossed as 100 in the accompanying text. It certainly fulfilled many of the same functions, yet differences remain in terms of a stark variance in size, down to legal particulars, such as the larcop or law price noted in the later Wantage Code of Ethelred II. Functional overlap between the two is undoubted, but notions of a shared origin assumes a great deal. I will now move on to give a very brief background to earlier scholarship on early medieval conciliar practices, particularly with regard to the 100, before outlining my methodology for the present survey. The results are divided broadly into location and site. The former focuses on the immediate and wider location of the site, while the latter is concerned with the specific form of the sites themselves. I hope to demonstrate that while the vast majority of these assembly sites were integrated within the statewide network of hundreds and wapentakes in the 10th century, the surviving evidence shows them to have functioned as nodes of episodic early medieval activity prior to this time. In tandem with this, a wider examination of their location increasingly suggests that they were integrated within local communications and the agricultural economy. The vast majority were positioned at a short distance away from estate centres, with some positioned at the very border of the estates themselves. This would indicate that they were well integrated to the local administrative landscape, albeit as dispersed nodes of function, one that counterintuitively appears to be set apart from foci of trading activity, despite a relative wealth of evidence for ordnance concerned with the regulation of trade. Drawing this material together, it suggests that the emergence of the 100 at the end of the early medieval period was a process that saw the co-option of earlier nodes of local conciliar practice within a national framework, rather than the establishment of conciliar venues themselves. So, in terms of origin, far more ink has been spilt on the matter of the 100 than the supposed northern analogue, the wapentake. Early writers, such as William of Malmesbury and Richard of Devizes, ascribed the scheme to Alfred of Wessex, and the early 12th century laws of Edward the Confessor were much quoted in relation to its origin and functioning. With the rediscovery of Tacitus's Germania, later scholars such as Camden, Selden, and Spellman began to link the 100 of England with the sparse accounts of assembly asserted by Tacitus to have taken place anciently in the lands north of Rome. There was also more willingness to link the 100 to continental parallels, as seen in Twisden's Glossarium. As the 100 came to be set within a far wider temporal and geographical framework, so it increasingly came to be seen as one of several manifestations of an abiding and ancient Germanic democratic tendency. This marked a significant shift from the routine association of the 100 and its development with Alfred of Wessex. Little consideration was given to specifically Scandinavian influence, with Selden going so far as to cast the waves of Norse colonisation as a vainglorious attempt to destroy the ancient liberties of a Saxon Commonwealth. Conversely, by the early 19th century, scholars such as Francis Palgrave and Jens Worsaae were more keen to ascribe Scandinavian influence to the character of these institutions, with the former inclined to cast the Scandinavian evidence as that of pure survivals, in contrast to Anglo-Saxon conciliar practices increasingly corrupted by encroaching kingship. In England, the peak of this Germanic tradition came with John Kemble, strongly influenced by the works of Jacob Grimm, and William Stubbs. Stubbs made much of the commonalities between the English 100, the Frankish Malus, the Herit found in parts of Scandinavia, and indeed the Huntari known from parts of Germany. For him, these represented the folk districts that had emerged in the immediate post-Roman period, based on a far earlier model of districts known as pagi, as outlined in Tacitus's Germania. For the first half of the 20th century, these bottom-up democratic models of local governance held sway, while little scrutiny of how these local institutions related to wider structures of state governance, occasionally leaning towards state formation as an emergent property of folk institutions. The first conspicuous change was noted in Merovingian scholarship, where the centenarius of the Lex Salica in the 6th century was reframed from a murky Germanic tradition to a royal Frankish adaptation of late Roman military organisation. From this, the territorial quintaina that appear in 8th century Carolingian sources did not represent ancient territories, but rather evidence for the expansion and increasing organisation of the state. In a similar fashion, the 100 in England came to be seen instead as a top-down instrument of state control, closely tied to the expansion of Wessex towards the end of the early medieval period. In England, this concept had appeared earlier in the work of Helen Cam, but emerged with greater force in the works of Henry Loyne and later Simon Keynes and Patrick Warmaud. Considering their late emergence in the sources and the, at best, tenuous connections to earlier political institutions, this is difficult to argue against. Yet, whether it is earlier scholars arguing for democracy in the localities, or more recent ones framing the hundred and wapentake as state instruments, there has long been a disconnect between our understanding of broader assembly principles and local assembly practice, a product in part of the poor source material available for the latter. In short, it does not follow that the late establishment of the hundred means the late establishment of the assemblies, where the hundred convened, or indeed of assemblies in general. Again, this is not controversial, as early references to the gemot of an ealdorman in the laws of Alfred attest to assembly practices in Anglo-Saxon England, before consideration even extends to the documented sins in courts related by Bede and the authors of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. This disconnect has, however, led to a parallel current of thought. Lawrence Gone, in Primitive Folk Moods, followed Grimm's work when he sought to articulate the various hundred mounds, trees and fords as primitive survivals of, again, ancient Germanic democratic leanings. While collecting a great deal of valuable material, the age of these sites was largely argued for by way of their archaic feel and dubious ethnographic comparanda, a conclusion left unchallenged in the climate of the time. As the attitude of historical scholarship changed, so the sense of the abiding and ancient assembly site came to be challenged, notably by Adkins and Petchy's examination of c.1100, focused on the site of a mound now obliterated by the library in the centre of post-war Milton Keynes. Work here showed that the mound was in fact a new foundation, with wider survey of earlier excavations in England indicating that it was unlikely to be a lone exception. From this, the authors dated the mound to the 10th century, tying it a little too readily to the date of the promulgation of the Hundred Ordinance. However, this pattern of new foundations has been revealed more widely more recently, both in England and Sweden, by Alex Sandmark and Sarah Semple, but they have also revealed that others are clearly of greater age, being either natural in origin, remodelled or reused prehistoric features, or at the very least, the focus of activity across the early medieval period. New assembly sites were certainly established towards the end of this period, but others had been the focus of activity, whether continuous or periodically, for far longer, leaving one with an archaeology of assemblies that sits uneasily alongside what is known of the legal development of some of their iterations, not least the hundred. Despite being reframed as instruments of late-state apparatus, many questions remain as to how the hundred and wapentake functioned, and what manner of relationship they had with conspicuous analogues found more widely in northwest Europe. There was much to pick over. To what extent was the hundred a judicial unit, a police unit, a taxable unit, and indeed a military unit? In past scholarship, conceptions of its functionality have often been strongly linked to conceptions of its origin. It possesses compelling analogues with earlier institutions found on the continent, but few clear and compelling antecedents are known from earlier Anglo-Saxon law, given the short span of time between the London peace regulations of the early 10th century and the first mention of the hundred. As for the wapentake, this has a Scandinavian name, but almost all of the functional characteristics of the hundred. Most strikingly, it does not have clear Scandinavian parallels. The term wapentake is encountered in medieval Scandinavia and Iceland, but not as a territory or as a court. Rather, it indicates a term of ascent, most visibly in the Icelandic gragas, or grey goose laws. In this compendium, the wapentake is an indication of the close of judgment. For instance, a determination of outlawry on a given individual would come into effect 14 days after the wapentake at a court. As such, the wapentake occupies an uneasy position, set within a Scandinavian region of influence upon a number of earlier Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For all the ambiguity, I hope to share that much can be learned from the investigation of the historical landscapes within which these political constructs were nested. The present study sets its focus on the three ridings of Yorkshire as a relatively well-defined historic region within the Northern Danelaw. This largely represents the core territory of the Viking Kingdom of York and represents the most visible demonstration of the Thrythunga, or Thirding, a territorial division known in Scandinavia and also found in Lincolnshire. It is also relatively well documented in Domesday Book and possesses the unique Domesday satellite known as the Yorkshire Summary, or recapitulation. As the name suggests, this is essentially a recapitulation of much of the main text, albeit ordered by hundred and wapentake rather than by fee. It presents information not found in the main text of Domesday, and in tandem the two provide a more accurate reckoning of the hundred and wapentake territories of Yorkshire than can be found for much of the rest of the Danelaw. In the absence of a clear type site that can be recognised in the archaeological record, the process of identifying assembly sites remains one nested in textual and toponymic evidence. These can be divided into two broad strands. The first comprises documented assembly sites, such as the named hundred and wapentake units of Domesday Book. The majority of the unit names refer to specific locations. A great many refer to landscape features, such as Skyrack Wapentake or Shire Oak in the centre of Headingley, just outside of Leeds. A sizable minority also refer to significant manorial centres and settlements within the territory, such as Driffield Hundred in the East Riding. A second class of assembly site can be identified from place name evidence alone. These comprise otherwise undocumented sites whose name elements refer specifically to the practice of assembly. These include the Old English elements mot, or meeting, spell, or speech, and the Old Norse thing, meaning assembly, which also occurs in early Old English sources. The occurrence of these name types had been known since the 19th century, as philological analyses developed and had an ever broader influence on other areas of historical study, but until recently had not been examined as a distinct category. While O.S. Anderson was the first to approach hundredal names in a systematic fashion, it was Aliki Pantos' 2001 thesis that was the first to investigate the occurrence of assembly attesting place names in a systematic fashion for central England, an approach since applied in Scotland by Oliver O'Grady. Through the identification of the location and distribution of the aforementioned elements, Pantos is able to demonstrate both the pervasiveness of undocumented assembly attestations and the presence of regional patterning within. The distributions were notably marked by a high concentration of thing names in the north and east of England, while also identifying a significant cluster of spell names in the Midlands. This was argued to reflect, respectively, the early coexistence of several levels of assembly and the impact of Scandinavian settlement in the latter part of the early medieval period. Beyond the identification of geographical patterning within name element types, there is also a broader observation to make, in that place names attesting to assemblies, whether of Old English or Old Norse derivation, significantly outnumber the documented array of hundred and wapentake sites found in Domesday Book and beyond, as seen again here for the three ridings of Yorkshire. Once a named site has been identified, the process of identifying the location can begin. In many cases, place names are apparent in modern Ordnance Survey maps. In others, though, recourse must be made to earlier surveys of the OS, tithe and estate maps, and sometimes even earlier to manorial extents. In landscapes where rivers can change course, place names can move and indeed expand to cover wider areas, among other quirks. It is essential to cross-reference as best one can in order to establish a location with a useful degree amount of confidence. One abiding issue of certain place name identifications has been a tendency, at least among earlier surveys of the English Place Name Society, to associate hundred and wapentake names with mounds, as these were deemed suitable assembly structures very much under the influence of Lawrence Gomm's primitive folk mutes. There is in fact an argument to be made for earthen mounds as a popular, indeed prominent class of assembly site, but it is not one that has been helped by an earlier bias in the place name data. Finally, once we have a location, consideration of the site and wider landscape can begin. This involved drawing together material from varied excavations, earthwork, geophysical, aerial surveys and so on, the collected archive material of the archaeological record as stored in the National Monuments Record and the local historic environment records of Yorkshire. This was a process that extended the focus beyond the site itself to consider its place in these wider landscapes of settlement and agricultural production. The archaeological synthesis was conducted in tandem with records of legal procedure associated with these sites in the later medieval period, recorded in varied inquisitions, charters and other records. Where sites could not be found or identified with suitable confidence, their presence in a historical record allowed some consideration yet of the subsequent functioning of these sites. As with the archaeological synthesis, historical consideration extended beyond the site itself in order to examine how these assembly sites sat within the territorial bounds of the hundred and wapentake units themselves, alongside the extensive reconstructed estates. Having drawn all this together, I then examined what patterns can be discerned. In their presentation, I plan to effect a broad division between what was revealed about the immediate and wider location of these sites and what can be discerned from their physical character. So, firstly, assembly sites in the Northern Danelaw do not seem to possess a strong relationship with coastal sites or river crossings, an observation that stands in quite significant contrast to a growing body of evidence from assembly sites of the same period in southern Scandinavia, where perhaps one might expect some commonalities with local political procedure in the Danelaw. There are some conspicuous exceptions in the case of river crossings, such as Stratford Sands and Bolesford in the West and North Ridings of Yorkshire respectively, though this does not appear to form part of the wider pattern. In line with the differential use of the term wapentake, this does not seem to suggest that Scandinavian political habits were being exercised in the cultivation of assembly locales in Yorkshire. The absence of a focus upon riverine locales is matched by the lack of a substantive relationship with what is known as the Roman road network, yet many, such as Tingley in the West Riding and Spellcross in the North Riding, were located at crossroads. The impression given is of integration not within national or regional, but rather local communication networks. There is one very frequent characteristic shared by the location of many assembly sites, regardless of variable form. The vast majority of both documented and place name attesting assembly sites are found situated at a short remove from significant settlements and estate centres throughout Yorkshire. This phenomenon can broadly be divided into two categories: those closely positioned on estate borders and those occupying a more ambiguous location, albeit still within the ambit of the wider distribution of settlement. Barkston Ash in the West Riding of Yorkshire comprises a wapentake focus of little note until one considers its position on the northern border of the pre-conquest archiepiscopal estate of Sherburn in Elmet. This interface is underlined by the detached portion of the adjacent parish of Saxton on the site of the ash tree itself. Stratford Sands, that appeared on the previous slide, the West Riding wapentake focus just mentioned, occupies a very similar position at a fording point on the northern border of Conisbrough Soak. Further, the North Riding wapentake sites of Bolesford and Birdforth are each positioned at the interface of large Domesday soaks, between Easingwold and Bulmer, and Coxwold and Topcliffe, respectively. It is likely that a rationale of a state border position has influenced more ambiguous examples as well. Okay. The Soak of Driffield, East Yorkshire, is largely coterminous with the eponymous Domesday 100. The road known as Spellergate, which is this one here, leads northwest of the town into the Yorkshire Wolds, almost to the artificial mound of Spellow Clump highlighted in green, overlooking the town on the Wold Ridge at the edge of the manorial ambit. In a similar manner, the surviving mound at Spellhow is situated on the Wold Ridge in Turbar 100, near the western extent of the manor of Hunmanby, Turbar 100. As with Driffield, the manorial centre was linked to the mound by the road from Spellhow, recorded in the 13th century Cartulio of Bardney Priory. Meanwhile, the old site of Huntow on Huntow Pastures, the name of the eponymous 100, looms on the Wold Ridge north of the manorial centre of Bridlington. However, these latter two examples do not obviously follow the estate border rationale, chiming instead with the landscape aspect noted at Spellow Clump, of the assembly site perched on a rise a short distance away from and overlooking a significant settlement centre, in this case Driffield. The possibility that ridgeline assembly occurred more widely, at least in the East Riding, is underlined by the presence of likely early medieval mortuary deposits on the Wold ridgeline above the hundredal settlements of Acklam and Hessel respectively. Beyond these more conspicuous examples, the vast majority of both documented and place name attested assembly sites are situated within a few kilometres of significant settlements and estate centres, such as Tingley with respect to Morley, also the name of the West Riding wapentake, and Ainsley Cliff, another Domesday wapentake name of the West Riding in relation to the city of York itself. Indeed, the only seemingly settlement-based wapentake focus, Osgood Cross, was in fact situated within an extramural market area of the medieval castle of Pontefract. It represents a near ubiquitous pattern, allowing for the physical and cultural topography of their respective locales. These liminal situations may well have possessed both pragmatic and symbolic aspects. They would seem to offer space, accessibility, and the potential for unmediated counsel and witness, almost theatrically so in the case of the East Riding ridgeline assemblies at Spellow Clump and Huntow. Their legitimacy may also have been underwritten by the liminal character of the venue. This is partially complemented by earlier legal proceedings. Frederick Maitland noted an estate border assembly of 849 in the Worcester area at Alvechurch, designated to counterbalance the local lord's own interests. Further, the 12th century Leges Henrici Primi cites estate boundary assemblies known as divisi, designated to tackle pleas between equal land and private jurisdictions. However, it is very unlikely that each wapentake or 100 assembly represented a simple clash of local estates. While this is ostensibly plausible for Bolesford and Birdforth, noted above, it is very unlikely for Berks and Ash, where the Sherburn and Elmet estate enjoyed effective hegemony over the wider wapentake. Instead, each local estate interacted with wider royal jurisdiction through the system of hundreds and wapentakes. Analogous procedure may have held sway in the process of resolving the tensions at this interface. The ridgeline locations of many of these riding assembly sites also happen to be on the interface between the arable lands near to the settlement and the pastoral uplands of the Yorkshire Wolds. This is very evident in the case of Huntow, situated on Huntow pastures overlooking Bridlington. It appears to represent part of a wider phenomenon touched on by Rosfaith and Susan Oosthausen, of extramural assemblies like Pennenden Heath in Kent and Mangrove Knob in Northamptonshire on proximate pasture. The argument goes that interweaving obligations in a mixed agricultural economy would likely have been administered in fora, likely public in nature, not least negotiating the movement of large numbers of cattle and sheep to and from pasture. These sites represent particularly accessible points on the interface between agroeconomic spheres and therefore make for ideal assembly sites. In time, as enduring nodes of conciliar activity, some became co-opted into Tudor Skinner, such as in Mangrove Knob and Huntow, while others even became associated with shire roots, as found at Pennenden Heath. It is an intriguing idea, but one that is yet to be put to detailed scrutiny, something I'd be very keen to follow up on. At the moment, much of the argument for antedating such assemblies rests on the assumption that formal or semi-formal conciliar settings were self-evidently obvious or even necessary. Again, this likely only explains some of the wider data set of assembly sites in the study area, but it complements the strong sense of state influence on the wider set of wapentakes. The border assemblies at Bolesford and Birdforth are matched by twin estates that are largely coextensive with their respective wapentakes. This is no more striking than in the Domesday wapentake of Dyke, later known as Pickering Lythe, which is neatly divided by the two soaks of the manors of Pickering and Falsgrave. In this instance, the relationship between the manor and the hundred is undeniable, though the direction of causation remains unclear. While it is true that no wapentake or hundred directly shadows a single estate, it is highly likely that the framework of wapentakes witnessed in Domesday Book was, if as late as argued, predicated on a lattice of earlier estates. Now I shall consider some of the evidence from the sites themselves. Okay. So, one of the first observations to make from the assembly site names themselves is the presence of repeated reference to a conspicuous if varied selection of landscape markers, ranging from trees, springs, crosses and fords, to name but a few. Amid these, mounds stand out. Eliki Pantos demonstrated that mounds comprise the second most common hundred or wapentake name in England after manorial appellations, at around 11%. This proportion rises to 43% when consideration turns to the corpus of assembly attesting names. Both figures tally with the evidence from Yorkshire. However, only 3 artificial mounds are extant, and then only partly. The later medieval riding court at Craig Hill, the assembly attesting Spellhow, and the similarly assembly attesting Spellow Clump, all in the East Riding of Yorkshire. Craig Hill is one of the few excavated assembly sites in Yorkshire, surviving as a remodelled hill spur in a dry valley of the Yorkshire Wolds. During these excavations in the late 19th century, John Mortimer found a flexed inhumation inserted into the southern side of the crest of the hill spur. The presence of worked iron with the burial has encouraged Audrey Meany and latterly Joe Buckbury to identify this as a secondary Anglo-Saxon inhumation. Craig Hill is also part of a larger monumental complex of Bronze Age and Iron Age barrows to the west of Driffield. The now destroyed mound at Tingley was the focus of more recent investigation in 2010, subject to a metal detector survey prior to a housing development. This site had earlier been described by Ray Thorsby as among the monuments of the Danish times. The survey identified a cluster of 8th and 9th century pins in the immediate area of the lost mound, alongside a 5th to 6th century brooch fragment, highlighted in red on the slide. Assembly mounds are too frequent to be dismissed merely as expedient landscape markers. Instead, the strong mortuary associations linked to barrows in general and to assembly mounds in particular has led several to argue that the ancestral and or supernal qualities linked to these sites were being appropriated in order to legitimise contemporaneous power relations, a proposition following on from Elizabeth Fitzpatrick's early work on the medieval Irish inauguration mounds. It is at least clear that they comprised potent and abiding landscape markers. The evidence from the mounds at Craig Hill and Tingley represents phases of activity in the early medieval period, divided by long periods of time. In a landscape of ancient earthworks, these were well-remembered places. In the Danelaw, there appears to be no clear relationship between assembly sites and churches, where the two are rarely in close proximity, such as in Pontefract, with the Church of St Giles and the Osgood Cross assembly site. The church is demonstrably later in date. However, standing crosses comprise the second most frequent monument focus in both documented and place name attested assemblies after mounds in the ridings of Yorkshire. This is exemplified by the wapentake of Osgood Cross and the assembly attesting place name of Spell Cross. Unlike mounds, this proportion does not reflect a national trend. The Old Norse place name element cross is largely restricted to the Danelaw. In hundredal contexts, around half of the instances of this element are located in Yorkshire alone. There is no commensurate array of assembly names associated with the Old English rood for cross. No actual crosses survive in Yorkshire, though an early 19th century account does describe the Osgood Cross, then in Pontefract Marketplace. Indeed, only one relic fragment exists in the wider Danelaw, that of the Ellowstone in Lincolnshire. However, in Yorkshire, another surviving orthostat did function as a wapentake focus. This is the Ronstan Model, situated in the churchyard of the eponymous East Riding village and dating to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. A court of dickering wapentake, as opposed to the preceding East Riding 100, was first recorded at Rudston in 1297, with a later proceeding in 1449 specifying the venue as Lestane. Interestingly, despite numerous archaeological watching briefs and evaluations in the village, no early medieval material has been identified in the surrounds of the monolith or within the footprint of the present village, whereas there's been plenty of later medieval and Roman material scattered throughout the area. However, evidence of an early Anglo-Saxon cremation cemetery does exist, juxtaposed with a Romano-British settlement directly south of present-day Rudston. This cemetery is in turn coextensive with more ephemeral 10th century activity, including a silver plate fragment and a coin of Ethelred II of England, suggestive of a bullion deposit. It appears to attest to at least one period of early medieval activity on the site of a cemetery that had elapsed many centuries prior. This juxtaposition of early Anglo-Saxon cremation material and Anglo-Scandinavian bullion is witnessed again immediately south of North Cave, another hundredal focus, which will be discussed imminently. There are evident mortuary parallels with Tingley and Craighill. One question of particular interest to the assembly project was the relationship between such assemblies and trading activity. Indeed, this was a special focus for Natasha Mailer in her work investigating the Icelandic assembly sites. Hundred and wapentake legislation relates in several instances to trading practices, notably in the giving of witness to commercial transactions found in the Whitpodstan Code, and of the hundred as a permitted trade of venue in the same document. Richard Britnell highlighted around 24 hundred manors with markets in England at the time of Domesday Book, yet compared to the number of hundreds and wapentakes identified in the later 11th century, this should not be considered a significant amount. In my own study area, cross-referencing Britnell's Gazetteer of Markets and Fairs with the hundreds reveals no obvious correspondence at an early date, and no sense that hundred and wapentake venues were influencing the location of markets as the charters for these trading venues increasingly proliferated. The earliest cited wapentake venue of Osgood Cross in Pontefract Marketplace in fact comprises the one exception. Trading activity can also be explored from an archaeological perspective. There are very few concentrated scatters of early medieval metalwork on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database that could indicate market activity in or at close proximity to one of the 100 wapentake identifications. This is not to say there are not some interesting outliers to this observation. In East Riding, a significant cluster of 8th to 9th century metalwork has been recovered 500 metres north of Pocklington at Mile Farm. These included pins and a number of stikers dating to the first half of the 9th century, accompanied by a small subgroup of early 8th century coins. The assemblies are too distinct merely to represent an extension or shift of settlement. Further, a similar metalwork fingerprint is indicated in the fields to the north of the village of Barnby Moor, 2.8 kilometres west of Pocklington. Either they represent an analogous node of activity or the shifting focus of one. In North Cave, a dense metalwork assemblage directly south of the village attests to early mortuary activity superimposed by Anglo-Scandinavian material, including bullion weights. A cluster directly west of the village likely represents formerly occupied settlement space. The juxtaposed bullion deposit is repeated at the later documented wapentake venue of Rudston, noted above. The parallels are striking. There is no clear correlation between trade and conciliar activity in Yorkshire, although these activities were on occasion associated at a short remove from the same focal settlement. Several documented hundred and wapentake names in Yorkshire refer to trees, including skyrack, from the Old English for shire or shining oak, and Yerlester, either Old English or Old Norse for earls or jarl's tree. No examples survive today, although the skyrack oak in Headingley is thought to have survived into the 19th century. Both Anderson and later Della Hook have stressed the role of trees as archaic boundary markers. More recently, Sarah Semple has highlighted the presence of trees as spiritually significant in Anglo-Saxon England, as seen in various later ordinances that attempted to forbid sanctuary and other activities in relation to trees, wells and stones. In this light, the preponderance of assembly crosses in the Danelaw could reflect analogous practice, though of sites established in a later milieu of renewed Christianity. There are also a very small number of sites associated with springs, including Welton or Springside Farmstead in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and Hallikeld, Old Norse for holy well, in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Hallikeld is in fact the one spring or well name in the Danelaw associated with assembly that utilises Old Norse nomenclature. Elsewhere, the Old English elements Wheeler or Mere hold sway. It is very unlikely that these sites were newly patronised in the Anglo-Scandinavian era, but it may be that their co-option within sub-shire administration was a late one. As with trees, sacral associations abound, as seen in Knut's legal prescriptions against worship at springs, trees and stones. The primary observation is not that assembly venues favoured certain sites, but that they are chiefly characterised by variety. When one considers how few are linked into the Roman road network, as opposed to ubiquitous integration of more local communications, it becomes clear that these sites were established and maintained within the context of local concerns. So, the move in historical scholarship away from folk institutions towards instruments of royal power has been followed to some extent in the consideration of the sites themselves and their associated landscapes. An antiquarian model of primitive survivals has given way to a far more complex picture in various parts of northwest Europe of new foundations, appropriations, and instances of longer term, if intermittent, activity at certain locations. In Yorkshire, the archaeological evidence from these sites provides further evidence for early episodes of activity on the focal sites of Domesday hundreds and wapentakes, seen in sites ranging from Tingley to Rudston. These are each mortuary sites of the earlier part of the early medieval period that became the renewed scenes of activity in the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. The preponderance of mounds and the uses to which they are put reinforces this sense of mortuary locales. These observations are consonant with thing assemblies known from Norway and Sweden. However, while it is tempting to pose a link between assembly practice and the mortuary associations of a given venue, these sites are also, more broadly, the result of a conspicuous episode or episodes of memorialisation. We may simply be dealing with expedient cultural markers in the early medieval landscape. The variety of assembly site foci, be they trees, springs and crossroads, and the recurrent cultic associations may support this point. However, the argument for expediency falters badly once trade, or rather its absence, is taken into account. Given the subject matter of the varying hundredal ordinances, it would seem reasonable to presume that trading activities could have overlapped with conciliar activities. However, there was no obvious correlation between the hundred and wapentakes of Domesday Book and a developing pattern of market centres. In the study area, some 8th to 9th century metalwork assemblages that could potentially be identified, interpreted as deriving from trading activity, are few in number, and where identified are situated at a short remove from the focus of the hundred or wapentake. The location is deliberately set apart in locations of abiding significance and meaning. In another way, however, this provides yet another reflection of the single most consistent characteristic of the assembly sites of the three ridings of Yorkshire. Whether they are documented hundreds of wapentakes or else unrecorded place names like the lost Tingwall near Whitby that attest to assemblies. Rather than integrated into manorial centres and other foci of settlement, or situated in an isolated no man's land, the vast majority of the identified sites are found instead at a short remove from manorial centres, and in some cases settlements recorded in Domesday Book. There seems to be little correspondence with the Roman road network, and it seems rather that these sites were instead integrated within local communications. In a number of cases, they are evidently situated on the border of a documented estate. A conspicuous number of others are located on the edge of pasture, most obviously demonstrated by the ridgeline assembly sites of the Yorkshire Wolds. many would appear to be integrated within the states as a dispersed node of function, and those situated on the edge of pasture suggest some degree of integration within the agricultural economy. The variety and the patterns within must represent a response to local realities, and the assembly as a crucial node for the negotiation of local concerns, quite before one considers its position within regional and statewide government. Where the archaeological evidence allows, the indications are that activity on these sites predates the promulgation of the 100 Ordinance and associated texts. These sites also appear to be very much integrated within local rather than regional or even national landscapes, as a dispersed node of function. However, this evidence by no means favours the older model folk institutions. It is more plausible that local conciliar nodes were co-opted within the mechanisms of higher order governance, a hypothesis favoured by the high-profile presence within Domesday Book, and indeed, in a very telling later phrase from the 12th century Dialogus de Scacciario, a manual on the workings of the exchequer, which I've probably mispronounced. In a dialogue, when questioned as to the nature of the 100, the teacher replies, "Ruricole milius hoc nort," or "the country people know it is better," before outlining the reckoning of hides within each unit. It is an illuminating picture of a bureaucrat who has experienced the institution purely in financial terms and at some distance. This would favour a model of locally organised governance co-opted within regional and statewide power structures, one that complements JEA or Jolliffe's proposal of the late emerging 100 as one of sparse definition, designed to mitigate clashes with the local legal practice, and so well suited for imposition in regions beyond Wessex. The seemingly radical emergence of the 100 in the 10th century may well rather have been a radical formalisation of varied local governments that had been developing for some time prior. In line with the wider findings of the Assembly project from Norway, Shetland, Iceland and further afield, top-down conciliar initiatives negotiating the territorialisation of expanding power structures with locally situated practices. Okay, thank you.